Hey everyone, in this video we're going to take a look at the first story from chapter 37 of the Road to Latin textbook. Now this chapter is called De Horatio I, and you're going to see it's about a very famous ancient Roman hero, right, from the early foundings of Rome, Horatius. It's about his sort of heroics at the bridge, the war that comes after the Romans get rid of their last king. All that kind of ties together into this semi-historical, mostly mythological account. But it's being the first story in a new chapter. I would always encourage you to, before you dive too far in, just do a couple basic things. The first thing I would recommend, if you want more information on this chapter or just see it in a different way, feel free to check out Nova Latin. You can find all my vocab help there, my grammar notes, videos, a bunch of stuff that'll probably help you on your way through. Just there if you need it. The other thing I would recommend that you do is start with the vocab. So it's very difficult to read and understand Latin if you don't know what the words mean. So the first thing you got to do, memorize all the vocab, make sure you feel really comfortable with it so that as you work your way through the story, you at least know what the words mean. The other thing I'd recommend you do is pre-read the grammar. So being the first story in the chapter, you're going to get a heavy dose of what this grammar is about. And reading it in the story gives you a chance to see it in context, which is always the best way to learn. So I'd recommend you at least look at it, even if you're not perfect at it. At least knowing what the grammar is will help you when you read through the story so you can see it, recognize it, and start to get a sense of how it all works. Some other recommendations, read the story aloud, right? If you're a student, find a classmate, someone you can read the story to, rather, so you can practice your speaking and your pronunciation. Then they can read it back to you and you can work on your listening skills. I always tell you, you never want to shut those skills off. It's the best way to learn a language, right? It's really hard to just translate and memorize things in your head. That's not how anyone learns the language. So you don't want to do it with Latin either, right? Bring it to life. Use all the parts of your brain. It will really help you out as you go. The last bit of advice I would do is when you're reading through the story, use the read and reread method. I mention it in all my videos, but it works. You take the story, you read all the way through, you write down any problem areas that you might have. And it could be vocab that you just don't know. Maybe it's a word you don't understand or a sentence or a phrase, whatever it is. Write it down and just make a giant list. Then after you've read through the story, go back to your list and try to figure out where you went wrong. If it's vocab you didn't understand, that's really easy. Just look up the word. You can figure that out pretty quickly. If it's grammar, it was probably the grammar from this chapter, right? As you're working right through, that could be the problem. Check your grammar notes or just look at it again. It might be different pieces of grammar you're just struggling with. You try to shore up all your deficiencies. Then you go back, you read the story again, and you keep repeating the process until you can get through this entire story without needing any help, any grammar, vocab, nothing like that. You can read and understand all of the story in its entirety or pretty close to it. That's how you know you're ready to move on. Okay. So if you haven't done any of those things, pause the video, go work on it on your own. If you're going to keep going, right, use it as sort of a double check just to make sure that you're on the right track. And as long as your translation is somewhere in the ballpark of mine, you can feel pretty good that you're doing well. Okay. I mentioned the grammar though, so that's where I want to start. Being a new chapter, let's just do a quick grammar overview, just so you understand what you're going to see in the story. If you want more in-depth grammar notes and explanations, check out my website because this is a very, very fast version. There's just not enough time to go through it in total detail, but it should give you a jump start to think about as we go through the story. So this chapter, right, chapter 37 is about degrees of adjectives. So that sounds a little bit tricky, right? A lot of my students don't know what I mean when I say that. So to simplify it, it's just kind of different versions of adjectives is all it really is. And the example I always give is good, better, best, right? Good, better, and best are all the same adjective, just what we call different degrees, right? Different sort of variants on it. So there's three key names you want to know: positive, comparative, and superlative. The positive degree of an adjective is just its most basic form: good, bad, happy, sad, right? Whatever your sort of basic adjective is. The comparative is exactly what it sounds like. You're comparing something. So it's when you're comparing sort of the quality of one noun to another. So these will be words like better, worse, happier, sadder. If you use the word happier, you need to make a comparison. You can't just say, I'm happier, right? What that really means is you're happier than someone else, right? You can say that, but there needs to be a frame of reference and you're still making a comparison. All right, that's just what we call the comparative degree. In English, it tends to be the ER version, right? So happy becomes happier, okay? The superlative is the highest degree when you're talking about quality of someone, right? Using an adjective. So what I mean by that, because even that can sound a little jargony, it would be something like best, worst, happiest, or saddest. So if you use happiest, right? So if you just start from the beginning, if you say I'm happy, you're talking about yourself. You're not comparing to anyone. You're just talking about your one person. If I say I'm happier, right, than someone else, now I've made a comparison. If I said I'm the happiest person in the world, I'm saying of all the people, right, in the entire world, I am the happiest. I'm the most happy. That's what we mean by the sort of highest degree. Okay, so these are what we call degrees of adjectives, and again, they're things that you would understand from speaking English, but maybe you've never broken them down in terms of their grammar. And it's important to do as you go through the Latin. So in Latin, the positive degree is what you've seen all throughout your Latin career so far. If you're using this textbook, the first 36 chapters, it's first and second or third declension adjectives. So in other words, osa, or isse, these are what we call positive degree. Okay. To form the comparative, it's a little bit trickier. The basic ending you're looking for is IOR, right? It kind of reminds you of IER in English when I gave you happier, right? Something kind of similar. But the IOR ending is what we use to make anything comparative, unless I put a note in the bottom if it's a neuter, right? Neuter adjective, it's IUS instead of IOR, right? But for the rest of them, you're using that IOR ending, and then you're adding a third declension noun ending to it, right? So is, ema, and down the line, okay? Now, it's important to note that IOR on its own is the nominative singular ending, and you can see it in the chart down below. Okay, so in other words, if you took lightus, meaning happy, if you make it lightior, now it means happier, right? Now, all those variants mean happier. So lightior, lightiorus, lightiori, lightiorem, they all mean happier. What you're looking at are just the different cases. The translation doesn't necessarily change, but remember, adjectives have case, number, and gender. Okay, so you have to think of case too. All right. Now, the superlative, in some ways, is the easiest. There are a couple irregularities about it, but the general superlative form for an adjective is issimos, right? So that iss in the middle is kind of distinct, and it helps you see it or notice it right away. So you'll notice it's using first and second declension adjective endings, right? Osa, So all you do is use issimos or and you're all set. Okay. So if you had lightus, happy, if I make it lightissimos, that means happiest. And you just use the gender you need in your sentence. Now, there are a couple little tricks. So adjectives that end in er, instead of using issimos, they just use rimus, right? So it'll be rimus, right? Celerimus is an example of it. So their superlative is a little different. And then there's 6 that you're going to see that end in lis that use limus, limus for the superlative. And I listed them here. The book also mentions them. So faculus, difficulus, similis, right? These words just use limus. So for instance, facilis becomes facilimus, right? So it's got the limus ending. That sounds confusing. It takes a little bit of practice, but the more you read and work on it, the easier this will be for you. So to give you just a quick snapshot of the whole thing, this is kind of what we're talking about: positive, comparative, and superlative. You can see the 3 parts of the chart here, kind of showing you what they look like. Again, the easiest thing to do is use it in context, but you always want to get a jump start reading through the grammar notes. If you use Nova Latin, there's some videos I posted that'll help you understand it too. You want to use all that to try to understand what the basics of the grammar, and then use the story to actually see it in context, like I was saying. Now, the last part of the grammar is related to this. It's comparison. So we just saw the comparative degree of an adjective. This is something along those lines, right? Kind of similar, but making just straight up comparisons in Latin. So there's 2 ways to do it. And the general idea here is how we say things like I'm happier than you, or I'm faster than you, something like that. So the first way you can do it in Latin is use the ablative, what we call the ablative of comparison. It's just using the ablative case. So if you said Julius est molestior, there's our comparative, right? Molestior Marco is in the ablative case. That means Julius, right, is more annoying than Marcus. You're implying the than. Okay, so that's kind of a simple way to do it. You're just using ablative, and there's more notes in the textbook that'll kind of help you through. But the other way to do it is quam. Okay. Now, if I take the exact same line, I can say Julius est molestior. That's the same thing. But instead of Marco, I can say quam Marcus, which means than Marcus. The quam, I feel like, is more common in Latin, and it's a little easier to see too, because you think of it as sort of like an equal sign. It's going to have the nominative case going with it. So that's a very quick overview of the grammar, and I can't cover all of it right here, but go check out the textbook, read your way through, and you'll be able to see this a lot easier. But for now, that should be enough to give you a start so that you can see these as we work our way through the story. Okay, so again, if you're feeling a little shaky, pause the video. Go back, read through the actual grammar of the textbook, or watch one of the videos, whatever it is you need to do. But if you do decide to move forward, we're going to just double check. You should use it as a way to make sure that what you did is pretty close to mine. Okay? So like I said, this story is about Horatius, and it starts like this. You have apud Romanos, Horatius cocles fuit claros miles. Okay, so among the Romans, Horatius Cocles, right? This is our famous hero. He was a Miles, rather, a famous soldier. Then you have Horatius fuit clarior vir quam multi principes. Okay, so here's our first comparison. You have Horatius was, fuit, clarior, more famous. There's the comparative adjective, right? A more famous man than quam. So this is using the quam comparison. Than multi principes, many sort of chiefs, right? Or princes, you might think. Okay, so he was more famous than many leaders. Then you have fuit multis regibus clarior. He was clarior, here's our comparative again, he was more famous, but now instead of using the quam comparison, we're going to just use the ablative case, multis regibus, right? He was more famous than many kings, multis regibus, okay? Appellebator clarissimus miles Romanorum antiquorum. So he was called Appellebator, right? Horatius was called the most famous soldier, clarissimus. There you see the issimus ending, superlative. So the most famous soldier of ancient Rome, Romanorum Antiquorum, right? Of the ancient Romans, technically. Okay, so it's setting you up to hear about Horatius. But you see in that first chunk, that first paragraph, we're already getting comparative degree of adjective along with different comparisons. So then we continue with the next paragraph. And you have quid fuit forte factum huius viri, right? So quid just means what? So what was the forte factum, right? What was the brave deed? These are neuter words. That's why you're seeing it forte factum. What was the brave deed, rather, of this man, huius viri, right? What was his brave deed? Numquam fortius factum a Romano gestum est. Okay, so never, right, was a braver deed, a factum fortius, right? A braver deed. Notice how it's IUS, by the way, fortius. That IUS ending is distinct with the comparative because it's going with a neuter noun, right? That's how you can tell what you're looking at. So never was a braver deed gestum est, right? A braver deed was done, you might say, by a Roman, a Romana, right? So never before was a braver deed done by a Roman. Factum Horati fuit fortissimum, solus copias hostium vicit. So the deed of Horatius, right, factum Horati, the deed of Horatius was fortissimum, was the bravest. And again, these first couple lines are very repetitive because they're trying to get you to see the different degrees of adjectives. So we went from brave, forte, to braver, fortius, to now bravest, fortissimum, okay? So the deed of Horatius was the bravest. So he alone, solus, right, by himself, alone, vicit, he conquered the copias hostium, the troops of the enemy, right? You might even say the soldiers of the enemy. Okay, so he alone defeated them. Factum nullius militis clariores et fortiores unquam scriptum est. So the deed of no soldier, nullius militis, right? So the deed of no soldier, and it's a soldier clariores, no more famous soldier. So again, if you put this all together, the deed of no more famous, you might say, clariores, soldier, and braver soldier, fortiores, umquam, right, means ever, scriptum est, ever was written down, right? So no deed was ever written down of a braver or more famous soldier. Again, we're just getting a lot of that repetition so you can see this in context. Then you have the next part. You have numquam fabulum de viro fortiore, numquam fabulum de facto clariore legatus. So never, okay, never legatus will you read, right? You all, legatus is future tense. Never will you read a fabulum, a story about a viro fortiore, about a braver man, right? That's fortior, right? It's the comparative form, just in the ablative case, right? Fortiore, go viro. So you will never read a story about a braver man, and you will never read a story about a facto clariore, about a braver deed. Okay, so you're never going to read anything better than what you're about to read. Again, it's a very long and sort of annoying setup in this chapter, but it's just a chance to have you repeat and see these different adjectives. Okay, then you have fabula de audacia huius fortissimi et clarissimi militis etiam a poetis scripta est. So the story, the fabula about the audacia, right, about the bravery or the boldness might be a better way to do it. The boldness of this bravest and most famous soldier, right? Of fortissimi et clarissimi militis, right? So the story about him scripta est was even, so etiam means even here, was even written a poetis, by poets. So it's saying he was so famous that he was actually written about, right? His story was written down by poets. Okay, facta nullorum virorum fortiorum et clariorum unquam scripta sunt. Okay, so the deeds of, and here we go, it's just repeating a lot, of no braver fortiorum virorum men, right? So the deeds of no braver, no braver men, rather, and clariorum, and more famous men, unquam scripta sunt, ever were written. Okay, so the deeds of no other man were ever written down. So again, that's a lot of repetition, but again, like I keep saying, it's just to give you a chance to practice these. Okay. Now we dive into the actual story. So you have ubi Tarquinius superbus postremus rex Romanorum propter acerimas injurias ex regno expulsus est, miserimus erat et auxilium a rege potentissimo etruscorum petive. Okay, so there's a long line to start. So you have when Tarquinius Superbus, right? So this is Tarquin the Proud. He's the postremus rex, the last king of the Romans, Romanorum, right? This is the famous seventh king of the Romans, and the last one who gets kicked out. Okay, so when he expulsus est, he was expelled, right? He was kicked out ex regno, from the kingdom, propter acerimas injurias, right? On account of his acerimas here is the superlative, right? So his most fierce wrongs, injurias, literally like injuries. So what this is referring to is all the bad things he did in his life, but most most famously or most well known is his son and the rape of Lucretia, right? That's kind of what it's all talking about here. And again, this is early Roman mythology. I'd encourage you to look it up, right? You can read all about it. So because of all these things, Tarquin the Proud, Tarquinius Superbus rather, he was kicked out, right, from the kingdom. And notice again how acerimus is R-R-I-M-A-S here. That's the superlative. Remember we said with an adjective ends in ER, use remus aum. That's what you're seeing here. Okay, so, and it repeats with miserimus in the next line. So because of all this, right, and getting kicked out, he was miserimus. He was very miserable, or the most miserable, right? So he's really upset that he got kicked out. And he petiuit, he sought auxilium, help, from the rege potentissimo, right? From the most powerful king of the Etruscans. So when Tarquin the Proud gets kicked out, he goes to the Etruscans, right? Those northern neighbors, the sort of enemy of the Romans, and he goes to their very powerful or most powerful king. There you have the superlative again, potentissimo, going with rege. Okay. Then you have Lars Porsena, Rex Etruscorum, qui era etiam Tarquinio acrior Roma magna cum celeritate contendit. Okay, so Lars Porsena, that's the king of the Etruscans, the Rex Etruscorum, right? So he's the most powerful king. So Lars Porsena, who was also acrior Tarquinio. So here we have a comparative adjective, acrior, right? It's describing Lars Porsena. So it's saying Lars Porsena, who was also fiercer, right, more fierce than Tarquin. Here's that comparison using the ablative case, Tarquinio, right? We're not using quam, so you translate it the same way. So Lars Porsena, the king of the Etruscans, who was more fierce than Tarquin, he contended, he hastened Romam, to Rome. Remember, when you have the name of a city, we don't need the adjective, right? So he hastened, or sorry, the preposition rather. He hastened to Rome with the magna coleritate, right? With the greatest speed, or with great speed. So he hastens off to help. Okay? Then you have sine mora fortissimis et celerimis copiis montem Ianiculum occupavera. Okay, so without delay, he had occupied occupavera, right? So he had occupied the Montem Ianiculum, the Janiculum Hill, right, which is outside the city of Rome. It's on the left, the western bank of the Tiber River. So without delay, he had occupied the hill. And he did this fortissimis et celerimis copiis with his bravest and fastest troops, right? So he takes his sort of best men and he very quickly occupies the hill, and now the Romans are in trouble, okay? Then you end with this. We have Tumero Romani magno periculo erant miseriores quam miseri miseri. Okay, so then truly, where, right? Truly, the Romans, they were miseriores, right? They were more miserable. And even before that, you have magno periculo, right? Explaining why. So you can say the Romans, because of the danger, right? It's the ablative of cause, because of the great danger, they were miseriores. They were more miserable than. Here's a comparison using quam. They were more miserable than miserimi seri, the most miserable slaves. So it's saying because of all the danger, it's kind of a weird comparison, honestly, but it's saying that they were so miserable, they were more miserable than the most miserable slaves. Again, kind of a weird comparison. Old textbook, we'll just take it for what it is. But they're very miserable is the idea, right? Because they're scared. Then you have non diutius era iter in urbem hostibus difficilum, right? Difficilum. There we go. So the journey was, the iter was non diutius, right? So no longer is really what it's getting at here. So no longer was the journey into the city in urbem difficilum, right? The most difficult for the hostibus, right? For the enemies. So it's not that hard of a journey anymore. So you could probably use very difficult here and say no longer was the journey into the city very difficult for the enemies, right? So what it's saying is because they're right outside Rome, they're across the bank, all they have to do is cross the river and they can get into Rome, right? So the Romans are in trouble. Then you have Pons Sublicius, qui era in flumine Tiberi inter montem Ianiculum et urbem solus hostes prohibeba. So the Pons Sublicius, which is the sort of wood pile bridge, literally that's the name of it, but it's that wooden bridge that had been built early on in Rome's history, and it goes across the Tiber River to the Janiculum Hill. So it's the Pons Sublicius, right, which was in Flumine Tiberi. It doesn't mean like in the Tiber River. It probably means like on the Tiber River or over the Tiber River is a better way to do it. It's crossing over it. So again, which was on the Tiber River, between the Montem Ianiculum, the Janiculum Hill, and the city, right? So that's the map. If you look at a map of Rome, you'll see it there. So it alone, solus, the river alone, was prohibeba, was preventing or stopping the hostes, the enemy. So the only thing protecting Rome from the Etruscan army is the Pons Sublicius. Okay. Then you have ante oculus Romanorum visio caedis et mortis miserimae era. So before the eyes of the Romans, right in front of their eyes, there was era, a visio, a vision of caedis et mortis miserimae. So a vision of slaughter, right? Caedis, right? Sort of destruction or slaughter, and most miserable death. Right, it's kind of a violent description here, but mortis miserimae, right, most miserable death. So it's saying this vision was right in front of their eyes, right? They can see their own destruction, looking them in the face when they see the Etruscans on the hill. Then you have Lars Porsena Deo crudelissimo similimos videbator itaque magno terrore moti sunt. So Lars Porsena, right, the king of the Etruscans, videbator, he was seeming, literally it's like he was being seen, but you could almost say like he seemed or was seeming, similar, very similar, similimos. And here again, it's a superlative using the li, the special lis ones, right? So it's limus. So he seemed very similar to Deo Crudelissimo, right? To the most cruel God, right? To a very cruel God. So he seems very similar to them, right? If you make that sort of comparison, they think of him as the worst kind of God coming at them. Okay, and so itaque, they were moved, moti sunt, meaning the Romans were moved, magno terrore, by great terror. So he seems so fierce and cruel, and he's right outside the gates. So the Romans are absolutely terrified of this. Okay. So we didn't get the whole deed of what Horatius does, but we've set up the story. Okay, so you're going to see it has to do with the bridge. The Etruscans are coming. It has to do with the Romans kicking out their last king. And now the Etruscans are coming to take the city. And the only thing that can save the Romans is this Pons Sublicius. And we'll see what Horatius does and why Horatius Cocles is famous. And he's well known, right, even today, why people still remember. Okay, so if you have any questions at all on that, I know that was a very repetitive story, kind of at the beginning too. But again, it's a chance to just see the grammar and context and get a lot of repetition on it. But if you have any questions at all, put them in the comments below. I'm happy to help you. Otherwise, keep practicing, keep at it. And like I tell you, the more you read through this, try the read and reread method. I promise it works. The more you read and practice it, the easier it should get. And you're trying to hit a point where you can read through the whole thing without needing any help and you understand all of it. If you can do that, you know you're in good shape. Good luck.